It has to. We have to have the crucifix in there for the people who are watching at home. Hi, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this month's Theology Night. We are picking up where we left off with last time's talk, which was on a history of the Catholic Church in the Pacific Northwest, starting with, or mainly focusing on Archbishop Blanchet and the formation of the Archdiocese of Oregon City. We're going to cover roughly the same time period. We're going to look at different people and different things happening. Now, if you want a copy of this original packet, you can find it by looking up the video version of that talk, which will be under the title Theology Night, or under the playlist for Theology Night on our Parish YouTube channel. And then there'll be a link in the description below the video with a PDF printout of this. So you can print that out, and if you and then this talk will also be posted for those watching at home. If you click on the link in the description below the video, you'll find a printout of the handout. All right. Well, so this talk is mainly taken from a book called A History of the Catholic Church in the Pacific Northwest, 1743 to 1983, written by one of the Spokane province Jesuits in the 1980s, Father Wilfred Shoenberg, S.J. And I picked up a copy of this at Powell's Books several years ago, and I think they're around. But it's an amazing book. And what I've done for this talk is basically I've just looked for certain threads of events or people, and then have to kind of go through and find them all and put them all together. So if you were to read the book, it's covering the entire Oregon Territory, Coeur d'Alene, basically Montana, Idaho, parts of Wyoming, Washington, Oregon, and that's the whole Oregon Territory. All right, but we're really just focusing on us here in the Archdiocese of Portland, which began as the Archdiocese of Oregon City, but that's from our last talk. Another book I'll just point out that you might find very enjoyable to read is The Life of Father DeSmet S.J., Apostle of the Rocky Mountains. He lived from 1801 to 1873, and that is available. It's printed by or published by Tan Books, and somebody gave this to me years ago, and that's a great read. Also, you can find a copy of Archbishop Blanchet's, what is it called? Sketches of the Church in the Pacific Northwest. I ordered it, but it's not arriving till tomorrow. But I mean, I don't need it for the talk. But it sketches over a 40-year period that he wrote in the 1870s and published, and it's still published today. So lots of good material out there. What prompted me to do this second talk is that Stephen Tobish and I went to the End of the Oregon Trail Museum in Oregon City about a month ago. And when we came in, I was really excited, and I said, I just gave a talk on the Archdiocese of Oregon City. Well, the guy didn't know what I was talking about. And I mentioned about how the Flathead Indians had gone to St. Louis 4 times asking for Blackrobes. And he said, oh, yeah, they were coming asking for the white man's book. And I said, oh, that's the propaganda around it, but that's not the truth of it. Anyway, I didn't go into that with him. But it was notable that there was not one mention of anything Catholic in the museum. No mention that there had ever been an Archdiocese of Oregon City, a cathedral there. No mention, hardly any mention of John McLaughlin, and then not a mention of him being a Catholic. And then we went downtown Oregon City to find the original site of the cathedral, because I think I think, Dennis, you mentioned, or somebody mentioned last time, that there was a plaque in downtown, a marker in downtown Oregon City showing where the cathedral had originally been. Well, we went to the address where the original cathedral had been, but there was no plaque. Well, there was a plaque holder, but the plaque had been removed. So there's nothing. The only things that, they were boasting about how it was the first Freemasonic lodge in Oregon or whatever. And it's this enormous building there downtown near where the cathedral was. And, and they mentioned something about the Unitarian Church, but not a mention about the Catholic Church. And after that day, I thought, well, I really need to get back to this presentation on the history of the Catholic Church in Oregon, because it's such an interesting and rich history. All right, well, that's our prelude then. Let us stand and pray. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary, Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Behold the handmaid of the Lord.
Be it done to me according to thy word.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
And the Word was made flesh. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Pray for us, O Holy Mother of God.
That we may be made worthy of the promises of Christ.
Let us pray. Pour forth, we beseech thee, O Lord, thy grace into our hearts, that we, to whom the incarnation of Christ thy Son was made known by the message of an angel, may by his passion and cross be brought to the glory of his resurrection, through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Okay, well, let's launch into this. I'll repeat a few things that we talked about last time, just to kind of return to the context and then expand on them. So the first thing we'll begin with an Iroquois Indian by the name of Old Ignace. And you might remember him from last time. He was from Canada. He came with the Hudson Bay Company, and he stayed. So in 1812, there were 24 Catholic Iroquois Indians from Canada who deserted from the expedition organized by Captain Hunt in 1811. Okay, so maybe he wasn't with Hudson Bay. I was thinking he had been. And they took up their abode among the Flathead Nation, where they intermarried and raised numerous families. So this was the introduction of the idea of Catholicism and the Blackrobes from the Catholic Iroquois who came and intermarried with the Flatheads. Now, Old Ignace, then, he converted many Flatheads, he taught them prayers, and he conducted a regular prayer service for many years before he was able to persuade his adopted tribesmen to seek Blackrobes in the East. So that's all starting in 1812. All right, so we skip forward then. Old Ignace, in the spring of 1831, so sometime later, Old Ignace had finally convinced the council to send for priests. And so in the spring of 1831, there were 4 braves who successfully but painfully reached St. Louis in the early part of October. Now, 2 of them died in St. Louis, and they were baptized when they were dying and buried there. The other 2 disappeared, and they didn't make it back alive. So they headed back, but they were lost track of. They never made it back alive. So the arrival of these Indians in St. Louis bore a curious fruit. The incident was given headline publicity in the Protestant press, and this gets back to my comment that I received at the Oregon Trail Museum. So the Protestant press erroneously asserted that the 4 travel-worn Indians had come from the west seeking the white man's book of heaven. which is the Bible. And that having fallen into the hands of the Romanists, they had been subjected to the errors of Catholicism and had finally left to return to their people with empty arms. Well, reports like this aroused such fervent enthusiasm that not one but several Protestant mission expeditions were soon dispatched to the west to bring to the heathens the Book of Heaven. So what we'll see now, I'm going to speak a little bit about the Protestant missionaries and then about Father DeSmet. And what we're going to see is two different approaches to this missionary effort, which are in conflict with one another. And, well, the conflict remains today. So let us start then. So the first of these was a Methodist elder by the name of Jason Lee and his nephew Daniel Lee. They arrived at Fort Vancouver in September of 1834. So this is 2 years later. And they brought 3 lay companions. They had visited the Flatheads en route, but they didn't stay. They departed soon. And there's reason to believe, based upon other things, that the Flatheads rejected them since they did not wear black robes, and they did not practice celibacy, and they did not carry crucifixes. Now, there was, I think we read about this the last time, in addition to Old Ignace, there was another Indian from another tribe who had basically spread around this prophecy that there would be fair-skinned men who came to, change the way people lived, and to, but he just, I forget what it was exactly, but he described priests who would bring, baptism and the Mass and all of that. So then, in addition to that, Old Ignace is evangelizing the Flatheads, who evangelize the Nez Perce, and then it spreads, and we'll see that here. So at Fort Vancouver then, the Methodists were warmly welcomed by John McLaughlin, who was an Episcopalian. Now, in his diary, under the date of September 29th, 1834, Jason Lee, one of the Methodist elders, wrote that his missionaries were being treated with utmost politeness, attention, and liberality, because at McLaughlin's invitation, Jason Lee preached at the fort. Now, the chief factor, when we say chief factor, that means John McLaughlin. He also persuaded the Lees to locate their mission west of the Cascades. So many of the missions were east of the Cascades, and he convinced them to stay and establish a mission there. So there were white settlers in the Willamette Valley already, so the Methodists selected a vast tract on the south bank of the river, Willamette River, adjacent to forests of fir and oak. And in 1 year, they spent 42,000 pre-Civil War dollars there, but making little progress because the Indians failed to respond. The Methodists soon conceded that the adults were comparatively hopeless, so they turned their attention to a school for children, but this too failed in its purpose. Now later on, the Methodists would vacate their mission in Oregon City, and the Jesuits would take that up would take that property and use it for their first house. In 1835, then, there had been rumors among the Flatheads in the Bitterroot Valley that year that Christian missionaries were en route. And they didn't know, were these Blackrobes or were these more Protestants? They didn't know. So the Flathead leaders sometimes expressed the hope that the 4 braves who had not returned, because they didn't know that the 2 of them had died there, having been baptized, and that the other 2 had disappeared on the way. They just didn't know. So they had a hope that these missionaries who they heard were coming were being brought with the 4 braves who had disappeared. And so one of these, a chief, Insula by name, he volunteered to go out and meet them at the rendezvous, and to their great disappointment, their missing braves were not there, nor were there any Blackrobes. But the rumored missionaries had come. They were the Reverend Samuel Parker, a Presbyterian, and Dr. Marcus Whitman, a missionary doctor on his first trip west. Now, Parker introduced himself and Whitman as envoys sent to establish missions in their midst. But Insula and his little band were not satisfied with the appearances of Parker and Whitman. They didn't have black robes. And the Lees, and like the Lees, the first Protestant missionaries, they too married, and they did not have the crucifix, and they did not have the great prayer, the Mass. And from all this, Insula concluded that they were not the Blackrobes that old Ignace had described, and he would have nothing further to do with them. With his warriors, he mounted his horse, and he hurried back to the Bitterroot with the bad news. And so it was that by the spring of 1836, when Dr. Whitman, returning with a strong group of missionaries representing the Protestant American Mission Board of Boston, this included two bitter opponents of Catholics, the Reverend Henry Spalding and William H. Gray. Then there was also an Episcopalian missionary, the Reverend Henry Beaver, with his high-strung wife Jane, who were on a British ship bearing north to Fort Vancouver. Now it mentions that she was a high-strung wife. So I don't know what effect that has, but maybe does that mean she was difficult or? So Beaver's arrival at Fort Vancouver, which had been long anticipated by the chief factor, John McLaughlin, but John McLaughlin was determined before he even arrived to snub him, marking the opening of hostilities between the Catholics and the Protestants. But keep in mind that McLaughlin was an Episcopalian. But he tended to side with the Catholics, which made a lot of the Protestants resentful of him. Well, the Reverend Parker was part of that first group, the Reverend Samuel Parker. He was the first one to arrive with Marcus Whitman. So the Reverend Parker, it is true, had already scandalized some pious Indians by picking a wooden cross off a grave, breaking it into bits, and casting it aside. And news of this alleged desecration of the cross had shocked many Indians of the interior, and Parker's mission, otherwise favorable, had been doomed to failure. But at Fort Vancouver, the conflict involved two Episcopalians, one of whom, Dr. John McLaughlin, was openly Catholic in his preferences. And deeply humiliated by McLaughlin's indifference, Beaver took the offensive, and he used his pulpit to publicly demand that McLaughlin would regularize his fur trade marriage by submitting to a formal marriage ceremony in his presence. So what had happened is that many of the fur trade pioneers had married local women, had married native women, and they didn't have anyone to perform the ceremonies, or they didn't have anyone religious to perform the ceremonies. And while that might not be as uncommon today, back then that was a really important thing for Protestants and Catholics alike. So he publicly made it known, pointing out McLaughlin as not being legitimately married, and he wanted to be basically the one officiating the marriage. But McLaughlin, with his wife Marguerite, arranged for a civil ceremony instead, in the presence of his assistant James Douglas, who became the de facto governor of the Oregon Territory. And so Beaver, the Episcopalian, sent scathing reports to the Hudson's Bay Company in London. And before McLaughlin sailed to London to defend himself and his policy of giving aid to American missionaries, the two men came to blows. So think about how long it took for Archbishop Blanchet to travel from Oregon to London, to England. He had to go all the way down the Oregon coast, around the Cape, and then over to Europe. And from there he came back to Montreal, and then back to France, and then back to the United States, around the Cape, and all the way back up. And that took, it was like a 6 month, voyage. So McLaughlin has to go all the way to London to answer these accusations. So the two men came to blows. And during McLaughlin's absence, Douglas, the one who had then witnessed the marriage of McLaughlin, he dismissed Beaver, who really pleased no one, not even his wife, his high-strung wife, and shipped him off to England, where he continued to carry on his battle against McLaughlin and his Catholics. So McLaughlin has enemies now, who even in another country across the world are continuing their battle against him. Now in 1839, so we skip forward a few years, in 1839 the Methodists revealed to Archbishop Blanchet. So there's two Bishop Blanchets. There's Archbishop Blanchet, the Archbishop of Oregon City, and his brother Bishop Blanchet of Walla Walla, and we'll hear about him shortly. But that's why I stumbled over it, trying to figure out who they're talking about. So in 1839, the Methodists revealed to Blanchet their wrath and indignation because he had rebaptized and remarried a number of persons already baptized or married by them. And finally, the Methodists complained to acting Governor James Douglas, the one who had witnessed the marriage of McLaughlin and dismissed the Reverend Beaver. So they complained to acting Governor James Douglas that the priests were using undue influence, quote, in order to keep the lambs of the flock out of the clutches of the Wesleyan wolves. Wesleyans would be the Methodists. So Douglas responded that the matter was none of his business. So the frustrated Methodists circulated throughout the valley copies of the, quote, awful disclosures of Maria Monk, an obscene book about Montreal convent life that had been completely discredited by Canadian Protestants years before. So this would be like, I don't know if you've ever seen any of those Jack Chick tracts or like little comic books that make outlandish claims about Catholicism, or it would be kind of like that, but this would be like stories of monks and nuns who had, broken their vows and were secretly, cavorting in the convent, which are made up stories because, like, why would somebody live in a convent if they were wanting to break their vows? They would leave. I mean, why would they live a life of penance? And back in those days, they would be fasting all the time. So it's like anti-Catholic propaganda. So they started distributing these books to everyone to discredit the Catholics. Now it was the settlers' turn to become indignant at this vile artifice, hypocrisy, and ingratitude of the Methodist ministers whose lives they had been the means of saving but a short month before. So the Whitman Massacre wasn't the beginning of the Troubles. It began many years before that. So it appears that an Indian had stolen some wheat, and having been discovered, was beaten so badly that his tribe threatened to massacre everyone at the Methodist mission. And Leslie appealed to the Canadians to save them, which the Canadians gladly did. So we have two different approaches that we'll see And this will continue into the next talk when we hear about what happened at the gold rush and the aftermath of that. We have two different approaches. We have what sounds like a very severe approach of physical, punishments and such, and then we have the sacramental approach, which is what the Jesuits brought. So we have a foretaste of trouble between the Indians and the Methodists at this point. Let us now turn to, and we'll return to that. So let us now turn to Father Peter DeSmet of the Society of Jesus, and it is his photograph that's on the cover here. So Father Peter DeSmet, was born and raised in Belgium. He became a naturalized American citizen, and he was an incurable romantic, and his love affair with his adopted country was exceeded only by another love, the American Indians. He seems to have had some fixed impression that all the Indians on the continent were ready and willing for conversion. All they needed was priests. They just needed priests, and they were, well, and you'll hear why he thought they were all ready and willing for conversion, because it would seem to be true, at least at that point. All he lacked, he often said, were priests to baptize them. And though his heart was as tender as a mother's, he had the courage of a bear hunter. He was absolutely fearless. Now, one feature of his character, and that was one feature of his character that saved his life perhaps many times. So he knew when he needed to get out, and he knew when he needed to forge ahead. And that courage, that he wouldn't back down, is what saved him. If somebody's confident and courageous, they tend to garner respect from others. Okay. But he was also very pious, and he was the type that saw a miracle everywhere. As the author says, he tended to discover miracles behind every bush. Now, it is said also that he was very different from Archbishop Blanchet, and I forget whether it's in here or not. But he would preach upon the love of God, and Blanchet would preach about the justice of God. And so it's said that the Indians loved DeSmet with a fanaticism, and they respected Archbishop Blanchet. Okay. So in the summer of 1839 then, this is something we talked about in the last talk, but I'll expand upon it now. So in the summer of 1839, this was the fourth delegation of the Flatheads and the Nez Perce to ask for priests. Fourth delegation that went to St. Louis. And so in the summer of 1839, there were two Iroquois adopted by the Flatheads, showing themselves willing to undertake the task of a fourth delegation to St. Louis to request Catholic priests. One of them was young Ignace, who was the son of old Ignace. And the other was Peter Gaucher, also known as Left Hand Peter. And they joined a Hudson's Bay Company brigade that floated down the Yellowstone River to the Missouri and on to St. Louis. And in passing St. Joseph's Mission at Council Bluffs, they stopped to visit the Blackrobes there, among whom was Father Peter DeSmet, a Flemish Jesuit to the Missouri Mission. So he was along the way. Council Bluffs is in Nebraska. Has anyone ever? Iowa. Oh, is it in? Okay, in Iowa. Okay, I was confusing it with another place. That's right across the river from, that's where they have the casinos, right? Omaha, right from Omaha, that's right. I haven't been to the casinos. But a relative of mine went there. I mean, there's nothing sinful about going to a casino, but it doesn't really appeal to me. So they met Father Peter DeSmet, and then they continued on. And they arrived in St. Louis and met the Jesuits at the university, who doubtlessly remembered young Ignace and Bishop Rosati, who assured them that a priest would be sent in the following spring. So young Ignace remained for the winter at the Jesuit novitiate at Florissant so that he could serve as a guide to the Blackrobe. And so he lived in the novitiate. He lived with all the other Jesuits. He took that whole religious life on. Now, he didn't become a religious, but as it says, continuing, when young Ignace appeared at his door, DeSmet was overjoyed. He really wanted to be one of those Blackrobes who came to the West. The prospects of a voyage to the far West to meet and baptize countless hundreds of already godly Indians stirred him so deeply that he could think of nothing else. And so he left Westport, Missouri for the great beyond on April 30th, 1840, and at his side was young Ignace, a Jesuit at heart, it says, destined to serve God in another way, which was as noble as his father's. So they came with the American Fur Company Brigade of some 30 members who were as anxious as he to reach the rendezvous to trade for the best skins. Now at that time, most of the Indians were at peace, and there were no other obstacles other than the vast expanse that lay in their paths. So after 2 months, they arrived at the rendezvous at the end of June, and 10 Flathead warriors were there to greet the Blackrobe. Our meeting, DeSmet wrote, was not that of strangers, but of friends. They were like children who, after a long absence, run to meet their father. I wept for joy in embracing them, and with tears in their eyes, they welcomed me with tender words and with childlike simplicity. Now, on July 5th, then, that was a Sunday that year, DeSmet offered Mass at the rendezvous on a stone altar on which he first placed wildflowers gathered on the green meadows. Quote, I preached in French and English to the American and Canadian hunters, and then through an interpreter addressed the Flatheads and Snakes. The Canadians sang some hymns in French and Latin, while the Indians chanted in their own tongue. The service was truly Catholic. The place where the Holy Sacrifice was offered has since been called by the trappers the Prairie of the Holy Sacrifice. And that place is still there. There's an altar there, and people, people go there specifically on pilgrimages to say Mass. Well, DeSmet, unlike Blanchet, preached mostly sweetness and light. Yeah.
Excuse me, where is that place?
Let's see. So that would be at the well, let's see. Let's see.
Go there as well?
Yeah, let's see. 53. I'll look that up. So the question is, for those of you watching at home, the question is, where was the Mass of the Prairies offered? So let's look this up. Okay, Great Mass of the Prairie. After the Great Mass of the Prairie, DeSmet and his honor guard broke camp and traveled north to the main Flathead camp at Pierre's Hole at the foot of the Three Tetons. So, somewhere south of there. Yeah, I think it is Wyoming. But if you look up the Great Mass of the Prairie, there are articles on that. And I did find an article, but I didn't save it. Okay. Now, after the Great Mass of the Prairie, then, okay, we just read this. They arrived at the foot of the Three Tetons on July 12th, and DeSmet was unprepared for what he saw, an encampment of over 1,600 Indians. Flatheads, Nez Perce, and Pen Doré. Not sure if I'm saying that correct. Pond Doré? Pond Doré? Ah, okay. I've heard that. Now, some of whom had come 800 miles to see him. DeSmet was escorted to the teepee of the great chief called Big Face, who welcomed him in the most solemn manner possible, saying, "Our hearts rejoice, for today the Great Spirit has granted our petition." So as we learned last time, this concept of the Great Spirit is not part of Native American spirituality. It was introduced by Christians as a means of them understanding something about the Holy Spirit. And so it was taken on by, I think, all of the Indian tribes as a part of their spirituality, but it was introduced by Christian missionaries. So DeSmet wrote a letter to Blanchet on August 10th, so a month later, from what is now Montana, introducing himself and announcing, quote, "I will return to St. Louis before the winter and will be back next spring with a caravan of missionaries who are already preparing themselves." Now, at that time, there were only 24 priests in the entire vice province of Missouri, including DeSmet. So the closest archdiocese, or the closest diocese to the Oregon City was in St. Louis. And that's where also the province of Missouri Jesuits was. So there were only 24 priests total among these Jesuits. And they were scattered throughout the huge Mississippi basin. But there were 6 Jesuits, 3 priests and 3 brothers, who finally gathered at Westport to organize their own wagon train to the west. So out of 24, they sent 3 priests and 3 brothers. And so that's a great, that's a great sacrifice, because, to be down 1 priest is difficult, but to be down 3 priests is a great sacrifice. In the morning, early on May 10th, 1841, the wagons started off in single file, the 4 carts and 1 small wagon of the missionaries. Next, 8 wagons. Now listen to how big this is for these 6 people. So 4 carts and 1 small wagon of the missionaries. Next, 8 wagons drawn by mules and horses. And lastly, 5 wagons drawn by 17 yoke of oxen. With the morning sun on their backs, the train moved steadily into the west, where the almost empty prairie stretched for over 1,000 miles. Can you imagine? Well, they met up with others along the way, which slowed them down. So the Flatheads urged them to establish their first mission in the Bitterroot Valley, which is south of Missoula, extending toward Idaho, and this is known as Montana's Banana Belt for its mild climate. This is where most of them wintered each year. So the Jesuits selected a site in the broad, fertile valley on the land the Indians had suggested, and they arrived at last on September 24th, the feast of Our Lady of Mercy, and they called this mission St. Mary's. So they've made it to south of Missoula. Has anyone ever been to the Bitterroot Valley? Yeah? Is it?
My husband looked there for a farm ranch.
Okay. Is it like, what would the weather be like there in the winter as compared to, say, other parts of Montana, which get pretty cold?
They say it's more of a banana belt. So
Yeah.
Probably snow. The mountains are right there.
Yeah, okay.
But maybe not so much of it.
Okay.
Don't know though.
Not in the minus degrees like some other places, perhaps. Yeah. So meanwhile, Blanchet, who's back in Oregon City, he wanted the Jesuits to move their western headquarters to the Willamette and establish a college at or near St. Paul, Oregon. And dazzled perhaps by the vistas that now lay open, DeSmet gradually yielded to Blanchet's proposals, but that was later in June of 1842, so that's 3 years later. Well, DeSmet made preparations at last to travel to Vancouver. So Fort Vancouver, in downtown Vancouver, it's still there. Fort Vancouver is still there. There's and St. James Proto Cathedral is just very close, and there's an old convent orphanage there, also real close to that, which is no longer owned by Catholics. But the foundations of the Catholic Church in Vancouver, Washington are all still there. You can take a tour of Fort Vancouver. It's very interesting. So DeSmet then left St. Mary's in Montana on April 13th, 1842, intending to preach to all the tribes on his route. So accompanied by Indians as guides and interpreters, he visited the Kalispels first. Now listen to all these names. If you know the geography and the various places around our area, these are all the names of places. So the Kalispels first, then the Kootenays, baptizing their children, the sick and the old wherever he went. And departing from his usual trail down the Clark Fork River, he crossed the Bitterroot Mountains and arrived among the Coeur d'Alenes, who had been eager to receive a black robe since the Flatheads had begun to brag about them. Then he visited the Spokanes, the Palouse, the Kettle, and the Okanagan tribes. They arrived at Vancouver on June 8th. So from April 13th to June 8th, he's traveling. Modeste Demers was there to greet DeSmet, and together they traveled to St. Paul, where DeSmet spent 8 days with the two priests, so Demers and Blanchet. This is before Blanchet is the archbishop. These are just two priests, Demers and Blanchet, at St. Paul. So he spent 8 days with these two priests, sharing experiences and discussing in an informal manner the needs of the church in the Northwest. So on Sunday, DeSmet sang a high mass and he preached in the church. And Blanchet showed him the Catholic ladder. And we talked about that last time. It was a means of teaching catechism by means of an illustration, and apparently it was used pretty widely. And DeSmet wrote, "That plan will be adopted by the missions of the whole world." So remember that. The Catholic ladder will come up later as we get into the aftermath of or the lead up in the aftermath to the Whitman Massacre. Any questions before we continue at this point? Thoughts?
How many churches were in Oregon at that point? Was it just St. Paul?
There was just St. Paul. There had been an earlier log church that was built by the fur traders around Champoeg Park, and then they tore that down and established it in St. Paul instead.
I mean, it kind of blows me away because this is a decade or two before the Oregon Trail really opened, right? And there's still people out there and Catholics out there.
Well, right when
1830s, right?
Yeah. When Blanchet and Demers first came, I don't believe. Yeah, I think they came with the Hudson's Bay Company. The Hudson's Bay Company had brigades that came out there, or people sailed by ship. But it wasn't at that point, and it wasn't at that point. And I think it even mentions that early on everybody was at peace. So this was probably at the very beginning of all that. But yeah, there was mass offered at Fort Vancouver, and the church though was built at St. Paul. And I think at this point that's it. At that point.
It would be also kind of interesting just to think about who traveled with the French trappers, right? Because a lot of them did work for, they either worked under French mark early on, or then they would have worked for Hudson's Bay. And then you look at a guy like Simon Fraser, who's actually a very devout Catholic. He's very backed by Montreal.
Oh.
He was a loyalist, that loyalist family. So you have this little Scottish Catholic enclave.
Okay.
But was sent off to discover to look for the Northwest Passage. And
Okay.
The river.
Yeah.
But then these guys would have brought whatever they had with them. And then the question is, how were they supplied who went with them?
They weren't.
Yeah.
They weren't. That's why they had to go all the way to St. Louis 4 times over a period of how many years to continue to request them. So there were Catholics here. There was a Catholic presence here early on, but there weren't any priests.
So I read recently about John McLaughlin, and he in 1830 requested from the Bishop of Red River,
Okay.
Canada. Is that a place?
Yeah.
For a priest.
Alberta.
Yeah. And he sent multiple letters to them and Quebec.
Okay.
And then finally, his boss got involved with the church in London to send
Okay.
priests out here
Okay.
because he had so many Catholic fur trappers
Right.
with him in the
Right.
Hudson Bay. The majority of the guys that worked for McLaughlin were Catholic.
But Red River's to heck and gone also, right? So, but that's the degree to which they had already
Yeah.
penetrated, and then that actually goes to being under the cover of Hudson's Bay, which is interesting, right? Because it's a crown corporation, right? And so they were tolerant of the Catholics, and again, they were and so you had this live let live thing north of the border to some extent, less so on south of the
In
border.
Canada.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it took them 8 years to get a Catholic priest out here.
Wow.
And then the Catholics were the only ones who were invited by McLaughlin.
Oh, okay. Well, the governance of the area was under dispute. It wasn't sure whether it was British or American, and so they basically had a treaty between the two governments to just kind of leave it as it was for the time being. And so that's why John McLaughlin became the de facto governor, just because he was the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company. Somebody else was going to say, Dennis.
Oh, I was just going to say that in the archdiocesan seal, there's like a red squiggly line, and that's to symbolize Red River.
Oh, it is. Oh,
Red River is
interesting.
like now titular C because I think it was suppressed sometime later.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
Well, actually, it's not suppressed. It's actually some type of weird thing with Alberta.
Okay.
Well, Alberta's a real Freemason stronghold too.
Okay.
It's like a weird, it's like complicated.
Yeah.
I looked it up one time. They're both together.
I'm very encouraged by the fact that others are reading and have things to share, because as I read, it just brings it's just opening up all of this history, and I didn't know any of this before, and it's just fascinating. And the other thing is that there's so many resources out there of things that have been published, even 150 years ago for us to discover. Yeah, Ambros.
Do we know, McLaughlin eventually became Catholic.
He
Do
did.
we know the year?
I think it was 46.
No, it was earlier than that. I think it was.
It'd be interesting to know
We covered that last time.
if it sounds like he had the virtue of prudence to hold off for the good, and probably would have converted sooner had it been prudent, perhaps.
Well, his mother had been Catholic, and his father was Scottish, and he grew up with his uncle who was Episcopalian. So I'm presuming Scottish, that his father would be Presbyterian, but he grew up with his uncle who was Episcopalian, and so that's what.
His dad was Catholic, and his mother converted to Catholicism to marry his dad.
Oh, is that it? Okay, right. So he was baptized Catholic, but he wasn't raised Catholic. So he had a sympathy for the Catholics. All right, where are we? Yeah, so he became a Catholic. He formally returned to the Catholic Church on November 18th, 1842, and received his first Holy Communion at midnight Mass on Christmas of that year. Okay, where are we? Okay, so DeSmet is visiting the two priests, Demers and Blanchet. So DeSmet, after a careful survey of the situation, we're on page 7 here, he finally decided to accept the request made by Blanchet and McLaughlin to establish a Jesuit residence on the Willamette to serve as a base of supplies for all Jesuit missions of the interior. Well, this would be a great stroke of business as far as McLaughlin was concerned, because the Hudson's Bay Company would need to provide all of their supplies, and they would be insured, a great account as far as this goes. So as the priests were journeying west by way of the Oregon Trail, Dr. Marcus Whitman was racing in the other direction, also by horse, to save Oregon, it was said, for the Americans, because of an alleged British and Catholic conspiracy to take over for Canada. So here's the situation. He heard that these priests were coming, and he wanted to, rush east to basically try to stop it. And so he spread a rumor that the Catholics were in league with the British, and that that they weren't Americans, and basically this kind of fueled that competition between Canada and the United States, and the divisions that were hardening between the French Catholics, who were the fur trappers, and the Protestant missionaries and those that they brought out with them. So the facts were these. So this is really why he left. The American Board of Protestant Missions, which sponsored 3 missions in the Plateau area south and west of the Coeur d'Alenes, had dispatched orders from Boston for the closure and proper disposal of 2 of these missions, leaving only 1, and they recalled the Reverend Henry Spalding and 2 others, including W.H. Gray, who was known to be especially anti-Catholic. So the missionaries directed Whitman to leave at once for Boston to persuade the board to reverse its decision. Their missions they weren't doing well. The Indians weren't going to them. At least not, some of them were, but not in the numbers that they had anticipated. So the Whitmans were gradually surrounded by, quote, Romanist priests, and they felt threatened. Mrs. Whitman had written a few months earlier, Romanism stalks abroad on our right hand and on our left, and with daring effrontery boasts that she is to prevail and possess the land. I ask, must it be so? The zeal and energy of her priests are without parallel, and many, both white men and Indians, wander after the beasts, meaning the priests. 2 are in the country below us, and 2 are above us in the mountains. End of quote. So we skip forward to 1843. DeSmet had gone to Catholic Europe to raise money for the Indian missions. He was preaching in the pulpits of Catholic Europe, and he said that his devout Indians only required money and missionaries to transform them into living saints. He already believed that they were naturally very saintly. In a natural way, they were very holy, and he just felt that by baptism and a life of grace, that they could be made into saints. So good Christians had a choice. They could go themselves to the mission, and he would gladly see to their transportation, or they could give of their wealth. And in his sweep through Europe, he gathered a shipload of miscellaneous supplies like books, candlesticks, or stones for grinding wheat. And he also collected 6 sisters of Notre de Namur in his entourage, and 5 more Jesuits, not to mention $30,000 in cold cash. Enough in those frugal times to put an archdiocese in Siberia on its feet. He chartered a brig called the Indefatigable and requested its captain to prepare a voyage around the world to Oregon. So now we have a breath of fresh air. We have the women. We have the religious sisters. And these came on a boat with DeSmet to Oregon. So the superior of the sisters, who kept a journal, and it's published. You can find her published journal on this time period. So Sister Loyola, and on July 31st, the Indefatigable cast anchor at length off the banks of Astoria. On the next day, the 6 sisters went ashore to visit the home of James Burney, who gave the sisters a royal welcome and introduced them to his many daughters. These were the first sisters to set foot in the Northwest. Now from Astoria, then 5 days later, the ship arrived at Fort Vancouver. When the sisters stepped primly ashore, there was a flutter of excitement as the Indians and whites saw for the first time the lady black gowns. On August 14th, a week later, with Blanchet serving as escort, DeSmet's missionaries embarked again in a flotilla of 4 large canoes and 1 small sloop, which slowly proceeded down the Columbia to the mouth of the Willamette, and then navigated past an island in the Willamette Delta and up the Broad River, heavily forested on either side. And the flotilla arrived at St. Paul at 11 in the evening, August 17th, 1844. So that took them 3 days to get from Vancouver, Washington to St. Paul, Oregon. You just think of how we take for granted how quick it is to get everywhere. You know, each year the St. John Society brings a group of walking pilgrims from Corvallis to the Grotto. And has anyone been on that? Yeah. You have. How long does that take?
It's like 60 miles over 3 days. So you do about 20 miles per day.
And the walkers are dead.
Yeah,
each day.
Tiring.
Almost dead each day.
Yeah. It's really fun though.
Yeah, I've heard that. So, when the 6 sisters then hopped ashore, this time it was with firm, determined steps. They were now engaged in founding the first convent school in Oregon. Well, when the sisters arrived, their convent was not yet completed, mostly because Blanchet had no certain knowledge of their arrival. So the sisters, like the Jesuits, were given temporary housing in St. Joseph's College nearby. So there was a college there already. Now they were going to build a convent school. So at St. Paul on the Willamette, meanwhile, the sisters finally completed their convent, and they basically were working to help build it. But they finally completed their convent called St. Mary's, and they moved in on October 19th. So this is 2 months later. And on the following day, Father DeVos, superior of the Jesuits, offered the first Mass in the Sisters' Chapel, doubtlessly the most elegant in the entire Northwest, because these were ladies. They were ladies. These weren't frontier women. These were ladies. And it does mention somewhere that the Sister Superior had it. Well, she was a little disappointed at how rustic everything was. Coming from the old world. Well, the sisters were happy, even with their convent, though the roof leaked. So brand new convent, and the roof leaked. Now, DeSmet continued his missionary work in the Oregon Territory through the winter of 1846 and 1847, and then he was transferred to a desk job in an administrative position in St. Louis, Missouri. So his missionary days weren't quite over, but he took on a higher level administrative position with the Jesuits. Well, 3 years later, after the territory had been named an archdiocese, and Blanchet had been consecrated bishop and named archbishop, he collected funds and missionaries in Europe, and he returned with 7 more sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, plus 3 Jesuit priests, 3 Jesuit lay brothers, 5 secular priests, 2 deacons, and a cleric, meaning a seminarian. So they've already got 6 of these sisters. Now they have 7 more. 13 religious sisters. They arrived in Oregon City on August 17th and St. Paul on August 26th, 1847. Okay, so the sisters are well on their way. I would love to do a talk just on the various groups of sisters who came and the various institutions that they opened here. It's very impressive. Now, here's a fact we didn't get to last time. McLaughlin was honored by Pope Gregory XVI. Upon arriving in his episcopal see, the new archbishop was much preoccupied with liturgical celebrations, filling the gap, as it were, because of the absence of a bishop for the preceding years. He was gone for 2.5 years from the time, and it took him a year to find out he had been named a bishop for the Vicariate of Oregon City. It took him a year to even find out, and then 6 months, I think, just to get around where he was going. But by the time he was because he went to Europe, then back to Montreal to be consecrated bishop, then back to Europe, and then back around to the United States. All that time he was collecting all of these people and this money. He was gone 2.5 years. It's amazing to think about that. So he had a lot of catch-up work to do, and when he came back, there was a beautiful brick church with a bell tower that had been built in St. Paul, and a cathedral that had been built for him in Oregon City, which originally looked like this. It's on the cover of last time's talk. So that's the original cathedral in downtown Oregon City, which used to have a plaque and no longer does. This has been erased from history. Okay, so he had first presented Dr. John McLaughlin with the honors bestowed upon him by the Pope, Gregory XVI. Pope Gregory XVI basically was Pope at the time that the miraculous medal was becoming popular. So this is the 1840s, toward the end of his pontificate. So he had created McLaughlin a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, which not only revealed the Catholic position regarding McLaughlin's religious status, but also said something significant to the Catholics themselves. So, I mean, you think about this little village in Oregon City, I mean, it really was just a village at the time, with a cathedral and an archbishop, and a Knight of the Order of St. Gregory the Great, and nuns, all of this. So the Pope's recognition of the former chief factor elevated the dignity of all. It was no longer proper to think of the Oregon Church as a primitive, uncouth mission. They had an archbishop and one among them a long, long way from Rome that had been honored by Christ's Vicar himself. So then we have the first ordinations. The archbishop hastened to and fro, administering the sacrament of confirmation on most Sundays in one church or another. So there were various churches now that had been built. He made elaborate preparations for his first ordination at St. Paul for Sunday, September 19th, 1847. Now think about this, September 19th. What Saturday falls after the Feast of the Exaltation of the Holy Cross in September? Anyone think about that? What important, significant Saturday falls after the Feast of the Holy Cross, the third Saturday generally of September?
First the King?
No. Ember Saturday. It's the Ember Week, when we fast for 3 days to consecrate the season of autumn to the Lord, and to fast for 3 days for the ordination of priests on that Saturday. This is the old way that it was done. So he was ordained on Ember Saturday in 1847, a day on which the Canadian farmers would take time from their harvest, because it was a fast day. Well, the church was crowded to the rafters, and he ordained to the priesthood Father John Jayol, in the first ceremony of its kind in the Oregon country. Then a second ordination followed on October 31st of Father Bartholomew Delorme, and on November 30th, 1847, Blanchet consecrated Modeste Demers as Bishop of the Diocese of Vancouver Island. St. Paul's was chosen as the location for the ordinations rather than the cathedral, because St. Paul's Church was bigger, and it was nicer. So think about that. Blanchet, it took him 2.5 years to go to be consecrated a bishop and come back. Demers was already here with him at the beginning. They were the two priests. Demers just got ordained, consecrated a bishop at St. Paul. How easy was that? He didn't have to travel. Yes?
I was just going to ask if it was just different back then that they only used one bishop to consecrate.
Right. They were counting on the other Blanchet brother being there, and he wasn't able to, so they had to do it just with two bishops.
Is this the same church that's at St. Paul, or is it a different?
I believe so. Now, at St. Paul, there is a model of the log cabin church, the log church, but I think that was the one that was at Champuig, where there used to be a town.
Wasn't there a fire in the church in St. Paul?
I don't know, probably.
Remember that in the Catholic Sentinel 20 years ago?
Oh, probably.
All right.
I don't know. But they survived. Okay, now where are we here? Well, so the disadvantage was that both of the Blanchet brothers had gone to Europe and collected all of these priests and money and religious and provisions and brought them back. Demers didn't get to do that. So he didn't have any priests. He didn't have any money. He didn't have all the things that the two Blanchet brothers had. So he had a more difficult time getting his diocese off the ground. Well, meanwhile, then, Augustin Blanchet, who was the brother of Archbishop Blanchet, he had been consecrated the Bishop of Walla Walla. So you recall when the from last time, or if you weren't here last time, when the Archdiocese of Oregon City was named, it was also two other dioceses were named as suffragan dioceses. That was Walla Walla and Vancouver Island. So Francis Norbert Blanchet is the Archbishop, and then his brother Augustin Blanchet is named the Bishop of Walla Walla. So Blanchet was only in Walla Walla for a very short time, and because of the aftermath of the Whitman Massacre, they removed the diocese from Walla Walla and moved over to Nisqually, which is downtown Vancouver, right by Fort Vancouver. And then that became the Archdiocese of Seattle, as Oregon City became the Archdiocese of Portland. So Augustin Blanchet had been consecrated Bishop of Walla Walla in Montreal at St. James Cathedral in September of 1846, and then he made his way to the Oregon Territory. So he wasn't there yet when this ordination happened of Modeste Demers. Father John Baptist Abraham Bruyere, who was a secular priest, a diocesan priest, and various others, including several OMI priests. So OMI would be like Francis Cardinal George, who used to be our Archbishop. He was an OMI priest, Oblates of Mary Immaculate. So these were, so this was a group of religious priests that came then to the Diocese of Walla Walla. And this Father Bruyere will figure in the story a little bit later as well. So these came from Montreal to St. Louis and via riverboat to Kansas City, and departed from there by wagon train on May 9th, 1847, along the Oregon Trail to Fort Walla Walla. Now Bishop Blanchet became, it's Bishop Blanchet, it wasn't DeSmet. Bishop Blanchet became impatient with the slow progress. And so on August 4th, he rode ahead on horseback with 3 others, riding about 35 miles per day, and arrived at Fort Walla Walla on September 5th. So he got there considerably ahead of everyone else. Now this wagon train, it mentions, they just started off with their group, and then it grew and it grew and it grew, so that it just really slowed them down, and he was very impatient. All right, how are we doing for time? Sort of getting there, aren't we? Well, I'll go quickly through the Whitman Massacre. You might have to read some of this yourself. This is a very interesting series of events, basically. So we've already heard of some of the early Protestant missionaries who came. So Augustin Blanchet, the Bishop of Walla Walla, while still at the fort, he met Dr. Marcus Whitman there on September 23rd. Now, Whitman was on his way from the Dalles to his own mission. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Y-E-E Lotpu? Does anybody know how that's? What is it? Wailatpu. So he was on his way to his own mission, and he stopped at the fort in Walla Walla to meet the new bishop, mostly to manifest his resentment because of the Catholic presence in the valley. He didn't like that they were there. Well, the doctor expressed himself in abusive language, shouting excitedly that he would like to take his own blood and smear it on the Catholic ladder to show the persecution of Protestants by Catholics. He became calm gradually, however, as Blanchet offered him words of friendship, and the two parted in amicable spirits. For the bishop, this shattering confrontation was an entirely new experience, and for Dr. Whitman, it was the beginning of the end. So from the beginning, the Whitman mission had not succeeded as he had hoped. He accumulated great wealth in land and livestock, but he was frustrated professionally. Most of his Indians had abandoned him. Now, here's what happened. The winter of 1846-1847 had been one of the most severe on record. Indian cattle and horses froze to death, and many of the Cayuse and Walla Wallas were attacked by measles and dysentery, and many of them died. So Whitman, who was a doctor, he was giving them simple remedies, and he did for them what he could, but his cures failed, and so he was accused of poisoning them as a means of acquiring more of their land. So in keeping with Indian custom, if medicine men fail to cure their patients, they are themselves doomed. Now, during the summer then of 1847, Paul Kane, who was a Canadian artist, visited Whitman and warned him that his life was in danger. Dr. McLaughlin, too, sent him reports of threats on his life. Basically, not threatening him, but sending him reports that there were threats on his life. And Whitman did talk about leaving, but he put it off until the following spring, and he wanted to come to the Willamette to retire there. Well, so now we get back to that Father Bruyère, who was the diocesan priest who came with Bishop Blanchet of Walla Walla. Bruyère chose the Cayuse tribe for his special care. And on November 27th, 1847, after a long, now listen to these dates here, November 27th, 1847, after a long delay occasioned by young chief's absence, he opened St. Anne's Mission in an old house provided by the chief near the Umatilla River, about 25 miles from the Whitman Mission. Now, this was only 3 days before Demers was consecrated at St. Paul, and it was only 2 days before Dr. Whitman, his wife, and 8 others were murdered by the Cayuse Indians. So he opens a mission for the Cayuse Indians. He's given the land for it by the chief. 2 days later, the Cayuse Indians murder Marcus Whitman, his wife, and 8 others. Bruyère was the first outsider to appear at the ghastly scene, so he discovered it. And he wrote a detailed, it's many pages long in this book. He wrote a detailed account of it, mainly because the military officials were investigating charges that it was the Catholic priest who instigated the murders. So Bruyère intervened to help Mr. Spalding escape. So you recall the Reverend Spalding, who had been, I think was he the one that was recalled to Boston and he didn't go? I think that was the case. Anyway, he was one of the original who arrived there. So Bruyere intervened to help Mr. Spalding escape from 3 armed Cayuse who were riding hastily in pursuit of him to kill him. And the Indians were mad at Bruyere for providing him an escape. And it says, quote, they said, the priest ought to attend to his own business and not to have interfered with ours. They said in an angry tone and started immediately in pursuit of him. So Spalding only, they would have captured Spalding and killed him, but a fog descended, very heavy fog, and he was able to get away. Spalding reached his own mission after 6 days, more dead than alive. He was terrified by his experiences, as well as by the threat of a violent death at the hands of the Indians. Now, here's what's interesting. He wrote to Bishop Blanchet expressing his wish for peace and his hope that the Cayuse and Americans can be on friendly terms, and that Americans will no more come in their country unless they wish it. But that's what he said to Bishop Blanchet. But no sooner had Spalding reached a place of safety than he began to demand vengeance on the Indians. All buildings at Waialatpu, except the grist mill, were burned by the Indians shortly after the rescue, and wolves had dug up the bodies of the victims. So Spalding wanted revenge. A volunteer army was equipped and dispatched under Colonel Gilliam before Ogden and Bishop Blanchet Ogden was another missionary, before Ogden and Bishop Blanchet had time to present their letters to the governor requesting peace. And the so-called Cayuse Indian War, the first of its kind in the Northwest, had begun, despite the offer of the 5 Cayuse chiefs to negotiate a just peace. So the Cayuse chiefs wanted to negotiate a just peace, but by then an army had been raised and it broke out into war. So at this point, Spalding, possibly deranged by his harrowing experiences of the previous weeks, began a campaign of vilification of the Catholic priests that did not end until he himself died in 1874. So several decades. Now this is what his campaign consisted of. Despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, Spalding's slanderous accusations against the priests were generally accepted as true by certain uneducated groups of Protestants. So the Protestants didn't necessarily believe this, but there were groups of them who did. These accusations can be reduced to 2. First, that the Catholic missionaries did consciously and deliberately cause the massacre of the 13 Americans at Waialatpu by manipulating the Indians. And secondly, that Bishop Blanchet was grossly remiss in protecting the 3 white girls of the mission from sexual abuse by the Indians. Now, there was a common consensus that Blanchet had done all that was possible. So we'll finish with this, and then we won't get to the next page. Well, we'll get to the very, very end. In the Diocese of Walla Walla at the time of the massacre, there were 3 groups. So here's more of the problem. There were 3 groups of Catholic missionaries at work. There was the bishop with his diocesan clerics, including Bruyere in and around Fort Walla Walla. Then there were the Oblates of Mary Immaculate to the west in Yakima territory, and the Jesuits in the mountains some 250 miles or more distant. Now, there were also 3 Presbyterian missions in the interior, those at Waialatpu and Lapwai, and a 3rd at Chimikian, I don't know how to say that, for the Spokanes. And all 3 of these missions had to be abandoned at once because of hostile Indians seeking vengeance. But the ministers at these missions, Archbishop Blanchet noted, became jealous in seeing the Jesuit fathers safe and quiet among the Indians of the Rocky Mountains. And the war against the Cayuse Indians did not directly affect them. There's much more to the story. But you can see how, oh, well, the Indians love the Jesuits, but they want to kill us. They wanted to kill the Protestants. Okay, we're going to skip over the First Provincial Council of Oregon City. You can read over that yourself. I'll just finish with this. Anti-Catholicism growing. So at Oregon City around February 1848, some of the American settlers, aroused by the wild charges of Spalding, the one who had barely escaped with his life, they were threatening to burn down the Catholic Church, and the Archbishop was informed that threats had been made for burning all the Catholic buildings in the valley. But wiser heads prevailed. No harm was done, and Catholics were free to come and go as they pleased. But a petition for the expulsion of all the Catholic clergy in Oregon was introduced into the territorial legislature in December of 1848. This was finally rejected by a 2/3 vote, meaning that 1 out of 3 presumably educated men had voted in favor of it. So we have a growing anti-Catholicism in the very place where it began predominantly Catholic. And there's so much more to the story, but that's all we're going to be able to cover for tonight.